friends. Great to see you. There we go. Excellent. Wonderful to see you and amazing to follow Carla. This is wonderful to have this conversation centered on the student. And what we'll do today is really center the conversation on what goes on inside the mind of our students as they're learning and what goes on inside the mind of our teachers as they're teaching. And so that's the focus of the conversation today. I really love the energy that's being generated in this room by every one of you. It's been a really beautiful shift, I think, from a deficit-based model toward a more asset-based model, which has been really, really inspiring. So I really want to call that out and say thank you for centering around the student, for centering around the assets of the student, and really thinking through kind of what could be the leading edge of innovation. And so to that end, we'll talk about the mind of our students. I'm actually going to start with the deficit-based model, sorry about this, and then we'll shift into the asset model, really around, centering around the idea that we have a challenge in education. Every single one of us in this room is here because we have a challenge in education. We know the statistics where we have a student dropping out of our K-12 system, one student every 26 seconds, which means that we'll have about 138 students by the end of this talk dropping out of our K-12 educational system. Now, that could be a good thing. It could also be something that we can measure in economic terms. And when we do measure it in economic terms, we see that college or high school dropouts tend to make, on average, $200,000 less than their high school graduating peers over the course of their life, and about $1 million less than their college graduating friends. And so what this represents for us as a nation is a collective loss of potential, right? Of just monetary potential. This speaks nothing to the amount of lost potential in, in social impact fields and all of this, but just in economic terms, this means that we're going to be losing $138 million in unearned potential just by the end of this talk. Get 1.2 million students dropping out of the K-12 system every year in the United States. So that amounts to $1.2 trillion in unearned potential, which, just to put in context, is as much as we spend in welfare and warfare combined, which again compounds the issue. So what about the kids that stay in school? We know that we're challenged for those kids as well. We know that on average, the US performs below most developed nations. These are not the current PISA scores, but the last round. We know that we perform almost at the bottom in math. So this one, we are 31st in math, right above, just above Lithuania, which is exciting, and Sweden, with Shanghai and Singapore almost always at the top, tripling almost the performance in math of the United States. It's not just in math, we also perform 23rd in science and 20th in reading. So we have a challenge. We are not the global leaders in education, despite spending almost as, I think we are the third highest spender per capita. We spend $800 billion per year for our education of our public school students. So that is, I think, we're the third highest per capita spender, and yet we are performing almost at the bottom. So there's a disconnect. What is the challenge here? What is the problem? We can't obviously throw money at the problem because that doesn't seem to be the solution, right? What if we could solve the problem with learning science? Looks like my slides have gotten a little funny. We'll do a, can you guys see that? Interesting. I wonder, can you see it says analogy with medicine? Interesting. Let's see if we can do that. How about that? Anyway, we'll just talk it through. We should see, okay. So the idea here is that if we want to think through some possible solutions, could we take a cue from what happened with the medical revolution about 200 years ago? So about 200 years ago, we had medical practitioners who were operating outside of kind of the context of what we knew about the human body, right? We had the practitioners not really syncing with the anatomists, the physiologists that really understood the science of the human body, and therefore the physicians didn't really have a ground truth in understanding the science of medicine, the science of the body. And so that led to things like using leeches and burr holes to the brain, although I hear that leeches is coming back these days, which might, yeah. So the idea here is that we started to have a revolution in medicine that allowed us to rapidly improve the efficacy of medicine by simply getting the practitioners really in deep conversation with the folks that understood the science of the human body, and that led to dramatic breakthroughs in medicine, the likes of which we could possibly see in education if we brought some of this model into the educational system. So the idea here that almost all of you, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces who are really advocates in this movement. It really is a growing movement to bring the learning science into our teaching practice and our educational practices, and really treating education as one of the most important applied sciences that there are, right? That the future of education might really be supported, really be grounded from a strong understanding of the science of how our students learn, and actually also the science of how our teachers learn to teach. Excellent. Oh, they're still bad. Is there any way we can reload this? Because I don't know that we're going to be able to see everything. Anyway, I'll keep going until you reload. So one of the ways that we can start this revolution in education, which again, a lot of you have already started, this really bringing together the science of how people learn into the practice of how people teach. What this could look like is, you can't see that, can you? Interesting, is really a co-creation, a co-creative process between the scientists who study how people learn and the practitioners, the educators who teach. With the idea being, let's see if you can see that, yes, okay. With the idea being that we need to move away from this linear model of just throwing the learning science over the fence and hoping that the educators will pick it up and really ground these principles of how people learn into strong and deep practices and programs in their classrooms. But instead, we need to actually be in a co-creative process with the researchers and the educators together at the table with equal voice. And also have it close that loop, really be a bidirectional dialogue between the researchers and the practitioners, because it's not just the researchers who understand how people learn. You educators really understand how people learn, and you understand how people learn in context, right? And that's what the researchers need. We really need a strong understanding of how kids are learning, not just in the lab, but actually in the real world and across multiple real world contexts. So this movement that we are all doing right now is really around closing this loop between the learning science and teaching practice, and starting to build in grounded scientific principles into the art of teaching. And so we want to make sure that we're not actually pushing this movement onto teachers or pushing this movement onto researchers, but instead respecting that we all have a really full plate, let's say, and that it's not fair of us to say, you teachers need to learn the entire science of how people learn, right? That's not fair. And likewise, it's not feasible for researchers to get out and study every single context of how people learn. And so possibly we need a new role. We might need a new conversation mediator. Let's see if that works. Can you see that? Yes. So the idea here is that this might need to be a mediated conversation. We might need to actually create a new role of learning engineering. And the idea here around moving from the learning science to learning engineering is really around the idea that every scientific discipline that's made an impact in the real world has not made that impact through the scientists. It's made an impact through the engineers who understand the science, they understand the problems of practice, and they use principles of engineering or user-centered design, design thinking, to prototype and iterate and test out solutions to some of these problems of practice. And learning engineering is not, it's not my idea. It's actually been an idea that's been around for about 50 years. It was first introduced by Herb Simon in an address to other university presidents as a call to action, as a way to professionalize the field of education preparation. so preparation programs for educators. And it's not until now that it's actually been taken up as a new field. And in fact, I think we have people in the audience. Do we have Boston College here? Yes, somewhere? Where? Okay, anyway, Boston College has a, thank you, in the back. Boston College has a new learning engineering program that they've launched that is a way to, well, I'll let them tell you about it. But the idea is really around how do we professionalize bringing the science of learning into the art of teaching, and how do we do that by growing a new generation of practitioner. The idea here is that it's not just the educators that will be in this conversation. We need to bring in all of the folks around the table. We need to bring instructional designers, okay, good, curriculum designers, environmental designers, classroom management folks, school leadership as well, so that we really build our environment of how students learn. But then we also can draw from the cognitive science of how people learn, the neuroscience of how people learn, the developmental science of how people learn, social science and affective science. There's a tremendously rich field of information about the various ways in which we learn, the various mechanisms of learning that can all be informing the art of teaching, but also that can be informed by the wisdom of practice, right? The social scientists are probably at the leading edge of this, but it's a really exciting thing that the scientists are now starting to recognize the wisdom of practice and really starting to bring in that contextual element into the research. So the point here is that an understanding of how people learn might really give us some guiding principles that we can use as axes of innovation around which to design our education innovations. Okay, what's a learning engineer? Very simply, it's a two-pronged thing, at least in my estimation of what a learning engineer could support the community in. The idea simply is helping understand how the research can be useful in real-world contexts, but then also closing that loop between research and practice and helping the researchers work with teachers, work with educators to really start to understand the context of use, the context of teaching and learning in the real world and across multiple contexts, so that the researchers can refine their research questions, so that they can ask better questions and use better methods to understand how people learn. So it really is meant to be a bidirectional dialogue. And in terms of what they would actually do, hopefully the optimal output would be building research practice partnerships around the country, and then having that centered around the processes of engineering, or again, user-centered design or design-based implementation research. We've got all sorts of different ways to do this, using the platforms of social infrastructure as well as technology to help scale this, such that it's not just single researchers brokered with single practitioners or schools, but instead building these education innovation clusters around the country and indeed around the world. Okay, so as a vision scientist, having this black background is going to be burning into your brain, so I'm hoping that we can reload this at some point, but is this okay? You guys can resolve, you can see things? Okay, excellent, great. Hey, look at that, magic. Ask and you shall receive. What are the tools of a learning engineer? Very simply, bringing the principles of the science of learning with the processes of engineering or user-centered design to start to prototype real-world solutions to real-world challenges. And what that might look like is there are lots of different processes, different ways to do this. One really effective process that's been used really pioneered by the Stanford Design School, the D School, is kind of design thinking, user-centered design that really starts with listening to the teacher, understanding what are the problems of practice, such that we can construct a point of view of the teacher in terms of the problems of practice of a teacher, ideate potential solutions based on learning science with an understanding of the context of use from the teacher and the student, of course, starting to prototype some of those solutions, excuse me, evaluating some of those solutions within context and then across contexts, and then starting to iterate through the entire process of how you can think through bringing the science into practice with the student at the center. Okay, how do we start? So let's start with syncing the research with the practice to help transform teaching. I personally have done this using a two-pronged approach. One side of my approach is working directly with educators. Another side is working directly with students. I do the educator work through my nonprofit and the student work through my lab at UCSF. And so we'll talk very quickly about the work that I do with educators, which is my favorite work, although the work that is even more deepening and exciting is the work with the students. But the work with the educators is particularly energizing. It's been a really fun set of experiences to see the tremendous appetite that teachers have for a different and richer understanding of how the brains of their students are working. So this process writ large starts with a conversation around our mental model, around how people learn. We have a lot of misconceptions. Even I, as a learning scientist, bless you, have a lot of misconceptions that were perpetuated in the culture around how people learn. So we talk about some of those misconceptions. We'll talk about some of them today. We reframe them using the principles of the science of learning, and then we think about how they may apply. So we'll do a super truncated version of this. We'll do a 10-week course in about 10 minutes. So total non-science of learning principle, but it'll give you a taste of what is out there right now. So we'll start with some debunking. So the idea around debunking is that there are so many myths of how people learn. They're just pervasive in our culture. It's bizarre. Well, we can go into how they get so pervasive, but the idea here is really that they can be harmful. Some of these misconceptions about how people learn can be harmful because they might replace effective teaching practices. They might also be harmful around beliefs about how you as a student learn or how you don't learn. But they can also misappropriate resources, right? So we have all of these ideas that are being pushed to educators every single day. I often ask educators, how many times a week do you get a solicitation for a brain-based program? And how many of those programs actually have evidence behind them? And it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. All of you educators in the room know what I'm talking about. So the idea here is, can we use the science of learning to think about and understand and be educated consumers of these products and programs to determine which are the leeches and which is the penicillin? Okay, so what's the harm? This is always the first question that we need to start with, because there are all sorts of beliefs that we have that may be fundamental beliefs about how students learn. And so what could be the harm around having those beliefs? Well, do you guys know about baby Einstein? Do you guys know the scandal around baby Einstein? No. I know. Somehow Disney has swept this under the rug and not allowed the public to have a really deep understanding of what happened here. So baby Einstein at one point had, I think it was something like 95% of the baby DVD market, which is a terrible thing that we have a baby DVD market, but 95% of the baby DVD market. And they kept putting out this idea that you stick your kid in front of baby Einstein, in front of our program, and you will grow, lo and behold, a baby Einstein. I think there were other ones too, like baby Mozart, right, thank you. So nobody evaluated these claims for a long time. And finally, some of my colleagues decided, you know what, we should actually evaluate those claims and see if this is actually a true thing. And what they found was that not only was this not true, that putting your kids in front of baby Einstein would make them smarter, but in fact, it was causing harm in a dose-dependent way, such that the more your kid was in front of baby Einstein, the more they would actually, at a later time, express attention-related problems and language delays, which is terrifying, right? Because these claims were not evaluated, and once they were, it was found that it wasn't just that you were wasting your money, but actually you might be causing harm to your kids, which really, really pushes the point that we need to evaluate these programs. We need to make sure that what we're putting in front of our kids, what we're doing with our kids, is really based and grounded in the evidence that it's going to do something good. And at the very least, is not going to be causing harm, right? So there was actually, if you still own any Baby Einstein DVDs, you can take it back to any place that sells, hopefully they don't sell a Baby Einstein anymore, but you can take it back and get a full refund. There was actually no class action lawsuit on it. They just said, everyone, you can just get your money back, which is very exciting. Not. The point here is that empirical testing, just as we do in medicine, is crucial to also do in education. And I really appreciate that there are current efforts in place right now that are really starting to shape the market around the value proposition of making sure that we are actually incentivized to test our products, to test our programs, to make sure that we're actually not causing harm, which is excellent. All right, so let's talk about some myths of learning. We'll blaze through this, even though this is my very favorite thing to talk about. So when we go through the course, we usually go through about 20 different myths of learning. And we don't do it like this because the way that we're going to do it here, because we're low on time, actually can perpetuate the misconceptions. So just be really intentional that when we're going through this, that this doesn't reinforce the myth for you, but instead helps us think through the misconception. So the idea here is, how many of you have ever said that you are a left brain learner? Right brain learners? So turns out there's no empirical evidence for this. We actually use 100% of our brain 100% of the time, and they are fully connected, right? So we all know this idea that left brain learners are logical, linear, sequential thinkers, and right brain learners are more abstract and creative. And there's actually, can you see this? Let's see. Excellent. So 80% of teachers around the world believe this myth, and even more in the public believe this myth. And it always comes across as kind of this, pop culture, like, oh, okay, great, who cares? If we are whole brain learners, what's the problem in saying I'm a left brain learner or a right brain learner? Well, the challenge is, once you have pigeonholed yourself as somebody, or once you've categorized yourself, or once somebody has categorized for you that you are a logical, linear, sequential thinker, that is the part of your brain that dominates, that tells you that your brain doesn't have the capacity for creative, abstract thinking. It shuts you down to learning opportunities that may actually be something that you could develop if you didn't feel like you already had that skill. But if you think that your brain doesn't have the capacity for it, then that can shut you down to a huge world of possibilities for learning. So that could be the potential harm for that. So there's no such thing as a left brain or right brain person. We use our entire brain. It's massively connected. There's not one part of the brain that is not connected across the hemisphere to another part. So it is really important for us to understand that we are whole brain learners, although the whole brain learning and teaching movement is another thing we can talk about later. Okay. This one is always the one that gets tomatoes thrown at me by the teachers. Myth of learning styles. Who has said they're a visual learner? Who are the auditory learners in the house? Good, you guys aren't raising your hands anymore. I appreciate it. Kinesthetic learners. So the idea here is that every single person who has learned anything, every single person who has taught anyone, has a really deep, grounded understanding that there are individual differences in how people learn. But is it carved? Is it best to carve it at the auditory, visual, kinesthetic joints? There's no empirical evidence to suggest that that is the right thing. In fact, there's even a $10,000 prize for any researcher or any teacher that can prove this myth that if you learn in your perceived learning style, that you will learn information better. There are 96% of teachers around the world that believe this, and again, even more in the general population. It's a massively popular misconception, again, because it taps into this thing that we know to be true, which is that there are individual differences in how we learn. what is true, so all of these myths of learning have some kernel of truth that have been really kind of blown out of proportion. So what is true is that we may have preferences in how we perceive information, how we take information in, but just taking information in isn't enough to learn it, right? We actually need to do some deeper processing of information to actually turn that perception into long-term learning. And what we really need to do is understand the information. So it's perhaps better to think about individual differences in how people learn by thinking about individual differences in how people make meaning out of what they're learning, rather than just how they're taking it in. So you can imagine that if you had a student who wanted to learn how to ride a horse, wanted to gain expertise in horseback riding, but she was an auditory learner. You don't think she's going to learn how to horseback ride the best by just telling her how to do it, right? So this underscores the idea that there are different things that can be learned in different modalities, and actually the idea of using multiple modalities is really important and really helpful. And one of the reasons that teachers push back on this so much is they say, but it works. When I teach something auditorily and then visually and then kinesthetically, they get it. Well, yeah, you've just taught it 3 different times in 3 different ways. And so really understanding the kind of mechanisms of how people learn is really important when you're trying to innovate within your educational practices. So the idea here is that understanding how students make meaning is a deeper and more effective way of thinking through individual differences and how people learn. And again, the harm for this could be that if you say, I'm an auditory learner, so if you show me something, I'm not going to learn it. Again, you're shutting yourself down to learning opportunities that you could have options for. Okay, this one's one of my favorites. So, who thinks that video games are rotting our students' brains? Good for you. Some elements of video game use can be harmful, like being sedentary for so long, like mindless eating in front of it for so long. But there are actually some elements of some video games that are actually really good for your brain. It's really interesting. So the category of video game called action video games. So those tend to be the first and third person shooter games. So in those games, they have the addition of violence that is up for debate on the long-term impact of exposing kids to violence, which we can debate afterwards. But the idea here is that if you actually extract out the violence and use the same kind of rapid navigation through a novel situation where they need to start to understand the rules of the game and make rapid decisions, that actually can train the executive function systems of our kids' brains and make them better able to learn how to learn. So this kind of metacognitive process of learning how to learn. So action video gamers, there's actually a 15-year history of studying the impact of action video games on the brain. Action video gamers have more efficient executive function systems. So here you can see that there is these are non-gamers and gamers doing the exact same task. You can see that gamers are actually needing to use less of their executive function system to do the exact same task, and actually they were doing it better. So it seems as though they have more efficient executive control systems. And I should say, they categorize, the people that study this, they categorize action video gamers as people who play 5 hours per week or more. There's obviously a cap on that. There's obviously too much action video game play that can be negative for the brain. They also this seems to be supporting your ability to learn patterns, to extract patterns from the world. Excuse me. And so the point here is not to encourage your kids to go out and play action video games. The point here is to understand the mechanism of how this works, and that really understanding how to find patterns in your world is a really strong principle of how people learn. Okay, one last one. Media multitaskers. How many of you have students that say, I am so good at multitasking with my phone and my computer and my homework? It is, as somebody who taught at Stanford for 15 years, it was those that were the people who were the most confident in their multitasking abilities were typically the ones that, when I tested them, were the worst at multitasking. Ned. So this is actually my nephew. So as somebody who has studied media multitasking for 10 years and the effects of media multitasking, it just pains me to no end to see my little nephew multitasking while he's playing this game. He's recording himself so that he can show his friends. But the idea here is that people who chronically do this, who chronically consume multiple media streams at once, they are more distractible. Shocking. They are the most confident in their multitasking abilities, and they have more reactive attention networks in their brain. So this is preliminary data of Stanford undergrads that we found. It was actually very hard to find low media multitaskers in the Stanford undergrad population. We filled that high media multitasking category pretty quickly, and we stuck them in a brain scanner and showed that actually the kids who did a lot of multitasking with media, their brains were more reactive to distracting information. So it's, what is it, squirrel? Like when something comes in, they couldn't stay on task. It was so much harder for them to inhibit the distracting information, which is really interesting. Now I have to give a caveat because this wasn't a causal story, right? It could be that kids who have more reactive attention networks, thank you, that kids who have more reactive attention networks tend to, see, I just got distracted by the timer. Can you tell I'm a heavy media multitasker? That they may have a bias toward being more engaging in more media at once, or it could be that media multitasking is actually changing our brains. So I'm doing a study to test that question. Until we know that direction, though, it might be prudent for us to think about limiting our simultaneous media use. Okay, so let's reframe. I'm told I have only 10 more minutes, so I'm going to blaze through this, even though this is the most fun part of this. This is actually the piece about science of learning. How does the brain actually learn? So we'll talk about it at a very kind of high-level perspective. Learning starts by experience, right? We experience an event, our brain's encoded into memory, they store that event, and then we eventually need to retrieve the right information at the right time. The reason it's nice to think about it in these 3 stages is because it means that there are principles that we can use to leverage each of those 3 stages to help deepen the experience, to help store that experience more deeply, and then to retrieve the right information at the right time. Okay. So how we first experience information is that you're seeing things, you're hearing things, you're feeling things, you're thinking about things, and how that information gets translated into a long-term memory is that you've got this beautiful little part of the brain called the hippocampus in the center of the brain that's just sitting there listening. It's like a microphone, just sitting there listening to everything that's happening throughout the brain, and it records some of that information into long-term memory. This hippocampus is also the part of the brain that helps us retrieve that information again in the future. But what I love about this little structure is that it's the reason that undergirds Dan Willingham's beautiful phrase that learning is the residue of experience, right? Learning is the residue of experience because your hippocampus is the thing that is recording it into memory, recording that residue. And so when we want to retrieve that information, the hippocampus then reinstates the original pattern of activity that you experienced when you were first learning the information. And so learning is accessed when the hippocampus reactivates the experience. And so we can leverage practices at each of these stages. We can leverage practices that help us lay down stronger memories, practices that help us store those memories more deeply, and then practices that allow us to retrieve the right information at the right time. So what might that look like? So anything that can actually make the signals that you're experiencing in your brain right now, anything that you can do to make those signals stronger actually gives the hippocampus more signal to encode into long-term memory. So things like paying attention to the information that you want to encode into long-term memory, making meaning out of that information, making it socially relevant or self-relevant. All of you teachers in the room know this is not telling you anything new, right? It's just telling you the mechanism as to why what you do by helping students pay attention, make meaning, make things self and socially relevant, why that actually works. Okay, but keep in mind, so one of our biggest propensities as educators is to try to make learning as easy as possible, right? But if we're trying to make learning as easy as possible, that actually engages the brain less, right? So this is counterintuitive. It gives the hippocampus less signal to encode into memory, and therefore easy learning will actually not be typically long-lasting learning. So what we want to do is actually make learning a little bit harder, right? This is the concept of the zone of proximal development. We want to keep those kids in their zone of proximal development such that it engages the brain as much as possible without being so challenging that they disengage, that they can't do it. But that actually engages the brain more, gives the hippocampus more signal to encode into memory, and, and that leads to longer lasting, more durable memories. Okay. All right, so this brings up another myth that things that make learning feel easy are often the things that students do the most, right? So things like rereading, highlighting everything, cramming. This gives us a myth of being fluent about the information, but yet it's very easy going in, which actually means that it doesn't engage the brain very much, creates very short-lived and weak memories. All right, so there are practices that we're not gonna have time to go into, but I'm happy to make these available to everyone. There are practices that allow us to build stronger memories. We'll move to storage. What are practices that help us store those memories more deeply? Let's go quickly. Anything that supports your hippocampus is something that will help your hippocampus store that information more deeply. Things like sleep, putting some sleep between learning and retrieving, hugely important because the function of sleep is to literally consolidate the learnings that happen during the day. It replays the events of the day. It's like putting Jell-O in the fridge. It solidifies the very labile memories of Jell-O. Anyway, we don't have time to go into that, but also exercise. Putting exercise either before or after learning is incredibly important. There is a researcher that calls what happens when you aerobically exercise. It releases a neurotrophic factor in your brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. They call it Miracle-Grow for the brain. It makes your brain a little bit more plastic and available to learn for a certain period of time. It's really an incredible, super easy way to supercharge learning. Okay, strategies that help you enhance storage are some of these. Again, we won't have time to talk about them, but there's so many I want to talk about. Okay, we can talk in the questions. Retrieval. So again, accessing the right information at the right time. The more you practice retrieving, the better the memory. The reason for that is when you retrieve information, it actually interrupts the forgetting process. And the more you retrieve it, the less likely you are to forget it. That seems very, bless you, that seems very intuitive. But actually what happens is when you retrieve something, you're actually reactivating, remember that original experience, and every time you reactivate it, that actually literally changes the nature of the memory itself. It builds bridges between the different parts of the memory and makes that memory much, much stronger. So frequent retrieval also changes the nature of the memory and interrupts forgetting. It's actually, if you take nothing away from the science of how people learn, retrieval practice is probably the biggest bang for your buck. Getting kids to retrieve something from long-term memory is one of the strongest and most powerful learning mechanisms. Okay, a couple of practices for maintaining better access to your memories. Again, we won't go into them. I'm not going to go into executive function, even though it's so exciting. I'll do just super high treatment. So executive functioning is really the foundation of learning. It is the core cognitive capacity that allows us to learn anything, to manage our attention, to hold information in mind, to be cognitively flexible, to update that information in mind. It is one of the strongest predictors of academic achievement, both in math and reading, and maybe the key to academic success. So it predicts academic outcomes, it predicts life outcomes. It's something that can be really a supercharge to your learning innovations. Let's get through this really quickly. What's so exciting about executive function skills is that, again, they've been found to be foundational across all domains, not just math and learning, but all domains of learning. Executive function difficulties are associated with often behavioral challenges, but what's really exciting is that executive functions can be trained. They are malleable. There are things that can boost the development of executive functioning. There are things that can mitigate the development of executive functioning, things like poverty, stress, early adversity. Things that boost executive function development is actually education, both formal and informal. Quality caregiving is massively protective. And explicit training of executive function skills. So I'm not going to go through my study, but there are ways to both understand, map out the executive function profile of kids, as well as train the executive functions in kids that we hope will boost performance in math and reading. So it may be the key to understanding how our students learn and what to do to optimize learning. Okay. Take-home messages. Treating education as an applied science is really what we are doing here. We are starting this revolution in education very similar to what was happening in medicine about 200 years ago. The future of our education innovation may really depend on solving some of these really hard problems with science, with the science of learning. And when teaching is really grounded in this science of learning, we can use these science of learning principles as our axes of innovation, but it's not enough to stop. It's not enough to go with the science of learning. We need to really translate this into the engineering of how people learn, really thinking through the art of teaching and the science of learning, and really making sure that we get our scientists and our educators in bidirectional dialogue. This may, again, need to be mediated through our new role of learning engineers. Thank you so much. Great to see you. Do we have time for questions? Do we have time for questions?
So Ben, why don't you bring a mic up and so we can take 2 quick questions. Can we bring a mic up from the back so we can take questions?
You can speak into
Ben?
my mic. Here, speak in here.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
A practitioner speaking to a
Excellent.
researcher. My name is Walter Duncan. I'm co-founder of the Validated Learning Company.
Great.
I guess I really appreciated your presentation, especially this idea of these two coming together. I almost thought of a gardener and a botanist
Nice.
partnering
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
way. As a teacher, I always thought of it as somewhat like a garden in your classroom. But I am worried about the way that students now are interacting with social media and like buttons.
Yep.
And it seems to me that there's a very addictive
Yep.
sort of dopamine loop going on with it. Can't stop.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's any research that is showing what the short-term and long-term effects are. I mean, I've got to hide the iPad from my son every single day, and
Yep.
he's so much smarter than me. He finds
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Great question. So there's a huge number of researchers now that are studying the impact of digital media and technology on the developing brain. And we're finding varied things, right? So it's important to keep in mind that technology is a tool, right? It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. When you talk about social media in particular, it's a very interesting thing because social media can actually have tremendously positive benefits to kids who are isolated in real life. It actually can function as a way to kind of broker a conversation, a larger conversation, and give them a larger kind of community. So in that sense, it can be really positive. But what you're describing is something that is also very pervasive of this loop that we're getting that may be mediated by dopamine of social reward and what we think. So this is just a hypothesis. This hasn't been proven yet. But our hypothesis is that might actually be shifting our kids' brains in a certain way. So our brains naturally have this kind of balance between exploring our environment to find the most optimal rewards in the environment and exploiting. Once we find a good rewarding thing, exploiting that reward. It's so it's explore, exploit. We hate using the word actually exploit, but you understand. It's like dating and marriage, right? So scientific terms. So what we think a lot of interaction with social media, particularly positive interaction in social media, we think it's actually shifting them toward being more exploratory in their bias, because we think that they're actually then now wanting to explore for more opportunities to get this reward, right? It typically is constrained by more opportunities, exploring more opportunities within social media. So we're testing this. We don't know yet, but your intuition is actually guiding a hypothesis-driven empirical research program to see if that's true or not, and to see actually how we can optimize our social media behavior in a way that is really mitigating the positives, elevating the positives, mitigating the negatives. I think I'll stop there, but actually let me say one more thing. I think it's really important to think through media use as kind of, what is your media diet? What would be a healthy media diet? So, we work with the American Association of Pediatricians because they're the ones that give out the recommendations for parents around responsible use of media. And they used to say no more than 2 hours per day of media use for your kids. Well, we were talking to them about it, and we said, you wouldn't really recommend no more than 2 hours of eating per day, would you? It might not be the right way to think about it. It might be a better way to think about the quality. So how do we think about eating? We think about what we're eating, when we're eating, how much, right? So it's a good analogy for media interaction, what they're consuming, how they're consuming it, and how much. Great question. Time for one more?
Yep, we can do one more question. Mike, there's a mic right here.
Here, I'll come back up here so everyone can see me.
Hi there, I loved your talk.
Thanks.
My question is, my background is in learning and emotion. I was trained as a learning scientist as well. I was wondering, from a neurological perspective, there's this trade-off between what students want to do and the optimal way for them to learn. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Oh, how much
really
time do we have?
Topic, yeah.
It's a great question. So this is actually, it's one of the things I speak very explicitly about with educators, which is that a lot of what the science of learning tells us are ways to make learning a little bit harder, right? Which kids don't like. They hate that. But it turns out that is actually, those are typically the practices that allow us to build deeper, longer lasting memories. And so one of the ways to mitigate that is to actually bring the students in as advocates for their own learning, right? And to talk about desirable difficulties, to talk about why these, and actually ground it in the brain, ground it in the conversation around how your brain learns, because it gives them a reason for why they want to do things that are a little bit harder. But it also empowers them. It gives them agency to do the things that are a little bit harder that may be better for them. So there's a whole conversation around that, but it's a great, great question. But again, if you ground it in the brain, if you ground it in a conversation around agency, that you are now empowered to learn anything that you want to learn, and don't be deterred just because it's hard. It's actually great that it's hard. So wonderful question. Thank you all for everything that you guys are doing for our kids and our teachers.